Bernie Ecclestone was a fairly mediocre racing driver, but he proved to be far more talented as a businessman. He never started a single Formula One Grand Prix as a driver, but it was Ecclestone who came close to reaching an agreement with the Soviet leadership to hold a Soviet Grand Prix in Moscow in 1983. And this is no exaggeration. The Soviet Grand Prix had already appeared on the provisional Formula One calendar for the 1983 season. So what went wrong? And why, during one of the most tense periods of the Cold War, did Ecclestone decide to bring Formula One behind the Iron Curtain in the first place? Let's find out. To understand why Ecclestone wanted a Soviet Grand Prix in the first place, we need to look at what was happening in Formula One at the time. In late 1971, he bought the Brabham team, but gradually began playing a much bigger role beyond his own operation. In 1974, Ecclestone became one of the key figures in FOCA, the Formula One Constructors Association, which represented the interests of the teams. By the end of the decade, he had effectively become their chief negotiator. Formula One had already expanded well beyond Europe by then. Races were held in the United States, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and South Africa, but Western Europe still remained the center of the championship. Most of the teams were based there, most of the races were held there, and individual Grands Prix still largely operated as separate events with their own organizers and their own terms. Ecclestone wanted to turn Formula One from a largely Western European championship into a truly global commercial product, and he was becoming increasingly ambitious about expanding its reach. Every new Grand Prix opened up new markets, new audiences, and new opportunities. But Moscow could offer far more than just another point on the calendar. Bringing a major Western championship to the capital of the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War would create an event that people would talk about far beyond motorsport, and it would also show just how far Formula One could now reach. Despite the boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics by a number of Western countries, the Games themselves showed that the Soviet Union was capable of hosting a huge international sporting event, providing the necessary infrastructure and attracting the attention of millions of viewers around the world. For someone who was actively looking for new and unusual locations for Formula One, Moscow no longer seemed like a completely unrealistic option, and soon the idea began to take shape. In the winter of 1981, serious negotiations began over holding a Soviet Grand Prix. The main representative on the Soviet side was Leonid Afanasyev, chairman of the Soviet Automobile Sports Federation and rector of the Moscow Automobile and Road Construction Institute. Afanasyev became the main supporter of the project within Soviet motorsport. He was also an important figure internationally. He served as vice president of FISA, knew its president Jean-Marie Balestre well, and was considered a possible candidate to replace him if Balestre later became head of FIA. Ecclestone probably had little idea just how difficult the Soviet bureaucratic system would prove to be. The Soviet Automobile Sports Federation could not make a decision on the Grand Prix by itself because it was subordinate to Dosaaf, the Voluntary Society for Assistance to the Army, Aviation, and Navy. This was a huge Soviet sporting and technical organization closely connected with the armed forces. It trained drivers, pilots, and parachutists, while also overseeing many technical sports, including motor racing. The leadership of Dosaaf, made up largely of senior military officers, was rather skeptical about the idea of Formula One racing through the streets of Moscow. A street race was considered too dangerous, and Soviet participation in such an event also seemed questionable. The country had neither its own Formula One team nor a driver capable of competing in the championship. There were ideological concerns as well. After all, this would be a major Western commercial championship, taking place almost in the heart of the Soviet capital. Ecclestone even tried to remove those objections. He offered to provide a Soviet driver with a Brabham Formula One car, so the lack of a domestic machine would not become an obstacle. But the objections from Dosaaf became a serious barrier, and the negotiations continued to stall. Eventually, Ecclestone decided to try to bypass the normal approval process and wrote directly to Leonid Brezhnev. Parts of that letter have survived. Dear Mr. Brezhnev, we thank you for your favorable attitude toward our plan to organize a Formula One Grand Prix in Moscow. We ask for the opportunity to meet with you in Moscow so that I can explain all the political and economic advantages that could come from an event of this level. The political prestige of Formula One racing is comparable to the Olympic Games. A major advantage is that you would be able to host this event every year. All technologically and economically advanced countries host Formula One Grand Prix. It is therefore surprising that a country as large as yours does not have a Formula One race. A city as large as Moscow could become part of the world of motorsport, which represents the highest levels of technology. But the letter never reached Brezhnev. It was sent to Dosaaf for review, and that is where it remained. Dosaaf's position seemed rather strange for several reasons. Car and motorcycle racing in the Soviet Union was certainly not regarded as some kind of capitalist pastime. Quite the opposite. Dosaaf itself actively promoted it. Sport occupied an important place in Soviet ideology, especially when it required physical fitness, discipline, courage, and technical skills. From an early age, Soviet children heard stories about pilots, polar explorers, racing drivers, and cosmonauts, while technical careers carried a genuine sense of romance and adventure. And one of Dosaaf's purposes was to turn that sense of adventure into practical skills. Through its schools and clubs, millions of people learned to drive, parachute, work with radio equipment, fly aircraft, shoot, and take part in other technical activities. Many of these skills had obvious military applications, so the organization had very close ties to the armed forces. At the same time, Dosaaf actively developed technical sports, from motocross and rallying to circuit racing. So motorsport was already a well-established part of the Soviet sporting system. From the late 1950s, Soviet crews regularly competed abroad. Moskvich cars took part in the Thousand Lakes Rally, the Monte Carlo Rally, and the Acropolis Rally, and later competed in the London to Sydney and London to Mexico marathons. The Soviet Union itself had national rally and circuit racing championships, purpose-built racing cars were developed, and in Tallinn, they were even produced in small series. More remarkably, from 1960, the Soviet Union had its own racing class with the unmistakable name Formula One. Of course, it had no direct connection with the Formula One World Championship, and the technical level of Soviet cars soon began to fall well behind the real Formula One. But the point is revealing. The country had its own drivers, designers, teams, circuits, and even several schools of open-wheel racing car construction. Even the lack of a Soviet driver could have been solved if there had been enough determination to do so. The Soviet Union had strong circuit racers who regularly competed in national championships and in the International Friendship Cup of the socialist countries. One of the most obvious candidates was Kiev driver Alexander Medvedchenko, who became Soviet Formula Easter champion in both 1981 and 1982. Another possibility was the young Estonian Toomas Napa, one of the strongest Soviet open-wheel drivers of his generation, who was already performing successfully in international competition. There was also the experienced Edgard Lindgren, although by 1983 he was already almost 50 years old. Of course, none of them could simply jump from a Soviet Estonia racing car into a Brabham and immediately fight Piquet or Prost on equal terms. The technical gap between Soviet open-wheel racing and the Formula One World Championship was enormous, so testing and serious preparation would have been essential. But if the lack of a Soviet participant really was considered a serious obstacle, it was certainly not an impossible one, especially since Ecclestone was prepared to provide a Brabham for the purpose. That is why Dosaaf's position is so difficult to explain rationally. By the very nature of its role, it should have been more interested than any other Soviet organization in bringing Formula One to the Soviet Union. Yet it became the project's biggest obstacle. Despite Dosaaf's resistance, the project remained alive, and in late June 1982, Ecclestone himself even traveled to Moscow to find out where everyone really stood. Bernie hoped to meet the Soviet leadership, but of course, he was never given access to Brezhnev. Ecclestone later claimed in an interview that he had actually spoken with the Soviet leader. Bernie had good reason to place some hope in Brezhnev, because the man who could theoretically break the deadlock with a single decision was himself a major car enthusiast. Leonid Brezhnev genuinely loved cars. He did not simply collect them, but regularly drove them himself. He was particularly fond of powerful Western cars, many of which came to him as diplomatic gifts. At various times, his garage included Cadillacs, Lincolns, Mercedes-Benzes, a Maserati, a Citroën, and a Rolls-Royce. One of the best known was a Lincoln Continental, given to him by Richard Nixon in 1973. During their meeting at Camp David, Brezhnev put the American president in the passenger seat and drove him at considerable speed along the narrow roads of the presidential retreat. Nixon later remembered the drive as a rather nerve-wracking experience.
No. Don't worry.
No. Slow down. This is a bad section. Take it easy here. There's a boat coming up. Very bad.
It is reasonable to assume that if the question of holding a Grand Prix had reached Brezhnev directly and required a simple yes or no, the chances of approval would have been fairly high. The problem was that the issue never reached that level. The project became trapped in the Soviet bureaucratic system. Dosaaf remained opposed to it, but the idea could not be killed off completely either. Negotiations continued, possible circuits were discussed. Ecclestone visited Moscow, and a Soviet round even appeared on the provisional Formula One calendar for the 1983 season. As late as the autumn of 1982, Bernie and his associate Mario Galanti still believed the project could be completed. Galanti even gave a likely date, the final weekend of August. But it was at exactly this point that the project began losing its most important supporters. In 1982, Leonid Afanasyev suffered a heart attack from which he never fully recovered, and he died soon afterwards. The Soviet Grand Prix had lost its main ally within Soviet motorsport. The project continued for a little while longer, but in November 1982, Brezhnev also died. The new leadership under Andropov showed no interest in the Moscow Grand Prix. Without support at the top, and without Afanasyev inside the Soviet motorsport system, the project finally lost the people who could have pushed it through. The first Formula One Grand Prix behind the Iron Curtain did eventually happen, just not in the Soviet Union. In 1986, the championship came to Hungary.